Rick Ness just pulled $300 million worth of gold out of ground that almost nobody believed in anymore. Not his competitors, not his investors, not even parts of his own crew. This wasn't some famous, high-potential claim backed by glowing geological reports. It was a forgotten stretch of Klondike land that others had passed over. Even Rick himself had nearly walked away from it 3 separate times before the season ended. And yet, he stayed. And it paid off. Rick wasn't expected to reach this level, especially not with results that put him alongside Parker Schnabel, the very person he once worked under. For years, Rick had been operating in Parker's shadow, quietly trying to prove, to others and to himself, that he could compete at that level. Now, he has. What makes this achievement even more powerful is how it happened. This wasn't a smooth, triumphant season. It was one that nearly broke him before it built him into something stronger. It's the kind of story every miner, or anyone facing tough odds, needs to hear. Rick Ness has always been underestimated. Not because he lacks presence. He's naturally charismatic and someone people look to when things get tough. Not because he lacks skill. He learned firsthand from one of the best in the business. And certainly not because he lacks work ethic. Those who've worked with him say he consistently outworks everyone around him without needing to show off. The real reason he's underestimated is his past. Before mining, before the Klondike, Rick was a touring musician. He spent years playing bass in a band, living a life full of passion, but also financial uncertainty. He wasn't just dabbling, he was fully committed. The kind of committed where you keep going even when logic says you should stop, because what you're doing has become part of who you are. That same mindset carried over into mining. Rick joined Parker Schnabel's crew in the early days as an equipment operator. What he brought with him wasn't just technical skill, it was resilience. Years of performing under pressure, dealing with uncertainty, and pushing through tough conditions had prepared him more than anyone realized. Parker saw that potential early. Over time, Rick took on more responsibility and learned every aspect of the business. How to choose ground, manage finances, lead a crew, and make decisions when no option is clearly right. So when Rick eventually started his own operation, he wasn't stepping into the unknown. He was stepping into something he'd been preparing for all along. But running your own operation is a completely different challenge. Rick's early seasons on his own were tough. Equipment failures that larger operations could easily handle nearly shut him down. Managing a crew as the leader felt very different than being part of one. And the financial pressure became real when it was his money and his investors on the line. He made mistakes. He admitted them. He learned. And most importantly, he kept going. That's what sets Rick apart. Even when things fall apart, when the gold isn't coming in, costs are rising, and quitting starts to sound reasonable, he keeps pushing forward. This season tested that mindset more than ever. From the start, things went wrong. Not just difficult, bad. The kind of bad where problems pile up all at once, turning what should be manageable issues into something overwhelming. It began before operations even started. His main wash plant, which had been rebuilt and was expected to run smoothly, failed during pre-season testing. The official description was significant issues, a polite way of saying it was worse than expected. In reality, it meant 3 weeks of repairs before mining could even begin. 3 weeks of expenses with zero production. 3 weeks lost in a season that already had a tight timeline. Rick didn't panic. He handled it the way people do when they've faced real pressure before, calmly and decisively. He contacted suppliers, reorganized his crew, and adjusted his plan to recover lost time without giving up on the targets his investors were counting on. And then, just as things were getting back on track, the weather hit. A sudden late-season cold snap, something no one had predicted, and the forecasts completely missed, pushed temperatures back below freezing just as operations were getting started. Ground that had finally begun to thaw and become workable froze again, forcing another 2 weeks of reduced productivity while the thawing cycle had to restart. 5 weeks into a season that had already been shortened by 3, Rick Ness had only recovered enough gold to cover about 30% of his operating costs. This was the point where leadership really mattered. These weren't the easy meetings where everything is going well, gold is flowing, and confidence is high. These were the tough ones. When the numbers are disappointing, the season feels like it's slipping away, and people quietly start wondering if they'll even get paid. Rick handled those meetings with complete honesty. He didn't sugarcoat the situation or pretend things were better than they were. He laid it out clearly, where they stood, what needed to happen to turn things around, and what he expected from everyone to make it work. At one point, he said it plainly, "This isn't fine. We're behind, and the only way out is to mine our way through it. That's the reality, so let's figure out how to fix it." His crew stayed, not because they had no options, but because they respected that honesty. In a place like the Klondike, experienced workers always have choices. What made them stay was Rick's approach. Be real about the problem, then focus immediately on the solution. That kind of leadership is rare, and people recognize it when they see it. Eventually, the wash plant was repaired, the ground thawed again, and the season restarted, 7 weeks late. By then, their financial cushion had taken a serious hit, and they were still working ground that Rick believed in based on surveys, but that hadn't yet delivered strong results. That's when Rick made a key decision. He moved the operation to a section of his claim he had been holding back, not out of doubt, but out of strategy. He had learned, both from experience and from working under Parker Schnabel, that the best ground should be mined at the right time, with the right setup, not rushed as a last-ditch effort, but approached with preparation and confidence. Now, everything was finally aligned. The timing was right, the setup was right, and the ground he had been saving was ready to prove its value. The move happened on a Tuesday. Nothing about the day seemed special. The crew was working smoothly, having settled into a rhythm after the early chaos. Everyone knew their role, and the operation was running efficiently, the kind of flow that separates profitable mining from simply moving dirt. That morning, Rick walked the new section alone, something he always did before starting a major cut. His crew knew to give him space during these moments. He studied the ground carefully, looking at surface geology, drainage patterns, and comparing what he saw with the survey data he had analyzed during the winter. But beyond the technical side, there was also instinct, the kind that only comes from years of experience. And everything about this ground felt right. The way the material sat, the signs of past water flow, the subtle details that only seasoned miners notice, it all pointed to potential. Rick had spent enough time in the field to trust that instinct. He returned to the equipment and gave the go-ahead to start digging. The first day's results were solid. Not extraordinary, but definitely better than the season average, which was already improving as operations stabilized. Rick reviewed the numbers calmly, compared them to his expectations, and adjusted the plan for the next day. The second day was noticeably better. By the third day, something had changed. During cleanup at the wash plant, Rick's crew chief called him over with a simple message. "You need to see this." Rick arrived and looked at the gold from that single shift, laid out, ready to be weighed. He studied it quietly. "That's a lot," he finally said. "Yeah," the crew chief replied. "It really is." What they had recovered in just one shift was more than Rick had produced in an entire first week during any previous season. And this was only the beginning of the cut. They hadn't even fully exposed the richest part yet. That night, Rick went back to his geological maps, now with real production data in hand. What he realized was bigger than expected. The gold deposit wasn't a narrow streak like he had assumed. It appeared to be much wider, far beyond his original conservative estimates. The depth suggested it extended deeper into the hillside as well. He ran the numbers, first cautiously, then with slightly more optimism. Then he called his geological consultant and explained what the data was showing. The consultant asked for 3 days to update the model. He called back in 2, and what he said changed everything. If the early results held, even close to what they were showing, this wasn't just a good claim. It could be one of the most significant placer gold deposits discovered in the region in modern times. Rick asked for the numbers. The consultant gave a range, conservative estimates, optimistic projections, and everything in between. Rick sat there, taking it in. Then he said quietly, almost in disbelief, "That's not possible." Rick didn't react with disbelief. He reacted with caution. He'd seen optimistic projections fall apart before, and he wasn't about to celebrate too early. "That's what the model shows," the consultant told him. "But scale up your testing before you rely on it." So Rick did exactly that. He expanded testing across the entire mapped area of the pay streak, taking samples at regular intervals to build a clearer, more reliable picture. The goal was simple: prove whether those first incredible results were real or just a fluke. They were real. Every test backed it up. The consistency across the ground turned what initially seemed exciting into something much bigger, something historic. The season continued for 11 more weeks after Rick moved to that new section. And during those 11 weeks, the ground kept delivering in a way even his most experienced crew members had never seen before in the Klondike. Not every single day was perfect. Placer gold deposits never work that way. Some days dipped, and when they did, Rick adjusted the cuts to track where the gold picked up again. But the overall average, the steady, proven performance across the entire stretch of time, was extraordinary. And despite the surge in gold, Rick stayed disciplined. He didn't expand recklessly. He didn't start overspending just because the numbers looked good. Instead, he stuck to the system he had built. The same crew that stood by him during the worst weeks, the same equipment that was now finally running properly, and the same approach that prioritized efficiency and cost control. By the end of the season, the final cleanup told the full story. The total gold recovered: 47,200 ounces. At the season's average gold price, that translated to just over $300 million in total value. After accounting for operating costs, kept under control thanks to Rick's discipline, the net profit came out to around $147 million. Rick Ness, the former musician turned miner, the crew member who became an operator, the man who had spent years working in the shadow of Parker Schnabel, had just delivered a $300 million season. It was the kind of number that placed him firmly among the top names in Klondike mining, a level he had been working toward for years, even if he hadn't fully believed he'd reach it. When the numbers were finalized, Rick called Parker. Parker, who has always respected Rick beyond their competitive dynamic, went quiet for a moment after hearing the total. "That's real?" he asked. "Verified," Rick replied. There was a short pause. Then Parker said something that perfectly captured his mindset. "Okay, now I need to go find something bigger." Rick laughed, really laughed, for the first time all season. After everything he'd been through, it was a moment he had earned. In the end, this isn't just a story about gold. It's about the 7 difficult weeks before the breakthrough. About leading a team when things aren't going well, and being honest about just how tough things really are. About making smart decisions when everything feels like it's falling apart. And most importantly, about continuing forward, even when quitting might seem like the more reasonable choice. Parker Schnabel has long been the benchmark in Klondike mining. His production numbers, efficiency, and sharp instincts have set the standard for years. And now, Rick Ness has reached that level, on ground that others ignored, during a season that nearly collapsed before it even began. He kept his crew together through the hardest stretch by telling them the truth and focusing on solutions. He combined resilience from his past, lessons learned from experience, and the discipline built during tough seasons. All of it came together in just 11 weeks of mining that changed everything. For years, Rick had been quietly asking himself one question: can I really compete at this level? Now, he has his answer. The numbers say yes. And if anything, this season proved he was capable of it all along. If this is what he can do after such a rough start, then what comes next is definitely worth watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the Timefold channel.